August of 1982, Mexico faced a financial crisis. It was hard-pressed to make the interest payments on its debt to foreign creditors. In effect, the country was on the verge of bankruptcy.
It's not very different in a country than in an enterprise or in a family. You cannot spend more than you earn in a consistent way. Finally, debt keeps going up, and when that stops, the new lending stops, then you will have to face reality. That's when the crisis started.
Mexico has come a long way since those days. The immediate crisis, the threat of default on the debt, was averted with financial assistance from the International Monetary Fund and the help of the United States government. But that was only the beginning. As a long-term solution to its financial crisis, Mexico embarked on a major program of economic reforms. The program was developed by the Mexican government with the help of technical advice and continued financial support from the IMF. Today, those reforms are showing significant results. This is Muebles Alfa, a furniture factory in Monterrey owned by Grupo IMSA. In the early 80s, it only produced for the Mexican market. The company wanted to export its chairs to the United States, but couldn't. The reason wasn't the cost of production, which was low. The problem was the exchange rate of the Mexican peso.
We found that our prices were not competitive because the peso at that time was overvalued.
When the peso is overvalued, it takes fewer pesos to equal a unit of foreign currency, like the dollar. That meant that Senor Canales would get too few pesos for each dollar he earned. In order to pay his costs in pesos, he would have to charge customers too many dollars for his chairs to be competitive in the export market. But in the mid-1980s, the peso's value was lowered to a more realistic rate. That made it possible for Senor Canales to export at a competitive price. Now he receives more pesos for each dollar, allowing him to cover his costs and make a profit.
Now we have been able to increase our volumes, and approximately 25% of our production is exported.
Senor Canales is not alone. The more realistic exchange rate has sparked an export boom. Now manufactured goods have overtaken oil as Mexico's leading export category, helping to reduce the country's reliance on world oil prices.
The exchange rate is one of the most important prices in the economy. It regulates the imports and the exports and the competitiveness of Mexico vis-a-vis other countries. So one of our major policy objectives is to keep a reasonable, competitive exchange rate.
This refrigerator plant is a division of the Vitro Company, one of Mexico's leading exporters. But Vitro wouldn't be able to export competitively if it weren't for another key Mexican reform, import liberalization. That's because several key parts for the company's refrigerators must be imported from abroad, like these motors from Brazil. Before, there was so much protectionism in Mexico, red tape, import restrictions, and high import tariffs, that companies like Vitro couldn't import the parts and supplies they needed at a reasonable cost. Now, however, the Mexican government has cut the red tape and restrictions and lowered tariffs dramatically.
The reduction of tariffs has made it possible for the Mexican product to be cheaper, since now it doesn't have the burden of paying import taxes, which makes the Mexican product more competitive than before. Today, we have much less red tape than before, and it is easier for us to be able to import the component product for our finished product.
Mexican consumers have benefited too. Now they can buy reasonably priced products from abroad, and Mexican companies that have to compete with those imports have had to lower prices and improve quality.
You have to open up the economy. How you do it, it depends on the situation. You can do it very fast or gradually, but you have to force your domestic apparatus to compete with the rest of the world. With huge fiscal deficits, you cannot have development, you cannot have improvement in the standard of living of the population.
The budget deficit was also a problem because the Mexican government printed more money to help finance it. That resulted in high inflation, and this inflation threatened the success of the entire reform program.
Inflation became public enemy number one and policy target number 1, 2, and 3. Everything came after that. And we had to pay a price, but we had to stabilize the economy first. And you do that by spending less and by earning more revenue.
To increase revenues, Mexico revamped its tax system. Tax rates were lowered to reduce the burden, but many loopholes were eliminated and collection efforts were stepped up. Government spending was cut dramatically too. One way was to reduce subsidies for everything from electricity to gasoline to water. Before, prices of these services had been kept artificially low. The government paid the difference between the price and the cost. Now, prices more closely reflect the real cost of government services.
After all this effort of 7 years, and mostly in the last 2 years, we now have a surplus, an operational surplus in the public sector of Mexico.
Another key step in reducing the budget deficit was privatization, selling state-owned enterprises to the private sector. Aeromexico is Mexico's second largest airline. Formerly, it was owned by the government. Service was poor and the airline lost money that the government had to make up in the form of subsidies.
And in the last 25 years, the government put into Aeromexico about $2.5 billion of subsidies because it was losing money.
Then, in 1988, the government declared Aeromexico bankrupt and sold the airline to private investors. The turnaround has been dramatic. Service has improved, on-time performance and reliability are high, and the airline is now turning a profit.
In terms of profitability, well, the former Aeromexico went bankruptcy, we're making money. That's a big difference. Between red and black, whatever it is enough for me.
The new owners were able to run the airline more efficiently, and there's a new spirit among the employees.
Let me tell you, how do we feel? It's like these horses that are being held before the race. They know that there is a race, and they feel that they can do it, and suddenly the door is open, and they go and race. Something equivalent is happening with the company at this moment.
The company today is making money. The company has more employees than it used to have when it was declared bankrupt. It has more aircraft. It has ordered more aircraft to be leased or bought, and it is paying us taxes. Not only are we not spending money in a subsidy, we're getting money of the taxes.
The Aeromexico sale was followed a year later by the privatization of Mexicana, the largest Mexican airline. The government also privatized hundreds of other companies, from sugar mills to steel mills to the telephone company. And in 1990, it announced the privatization of the Mexican banks, which had been state-owned since 1982. All in all, by 1990, the government had cut the number of state-owned companies from 1,200 to 400.
And the reason is very simple. We don't want to overspend, first. Second, you cannot have a government with so many assets in a poor country. Why don't you get rid of these assets, sell them to the civil society, and use the proceeds to bring down inflation and to spend on the basics. And the basics is education, health, infrastructure, better justice.
Some of the proceeds from those privatizations are being spent here in Chalco, a desperately poor town outside of Mexico City. Through a program called Solidaridad, the Mexican government is providing targeted relief for the poorer segments of the population. Milk prices in Mexico are not subsidized for the general public, but poor people with children can get milk for a fraction of the market price at dairies like this one. This dairy, and many others like it, were built by Solidaridad.
It's very economical. It helps us housewives to save money in feeding our children.
Solidaridad also is helping to wire Chalco for electricity. Solidaridad trucks deliver water to homes at reduced cost. And Solidaridad is building new hospitals and schools for the community. Money for programs like Solidaridad is also made possible by cutting general subsidies on services like electricity, water, telephones, and gasoline.
A subsidy that is selling to the public something below its cost is something which is very expensive for the government. And the problem when you generalize these subsidies, when you give it to everybody in an indiscriminate fashion, is that it is socially very unfair. If you have electricity rates which are subsidized for everybody, that means the rich are getting a subsidy which is the same size than the poor, when the poor need it most. So we have changed the tariffs so that they reflect the real cost of providing the service, and then get the amount of money, the extra revenue, to target to the really poorest in an organized fashion.
Throughout the 1980s, Mexico labored under a huge foreign debt approaching $100 billion. This was a tremendous obstacle to growth, since money that could have gone into investments and public services went to service the debt. But in March of 1990, Mexico signed an historic agreement with its commercial bank creditors to reduce the debt burden. The agreement is estimated to save Mexico close to $2 billion per year in debt payments. More importantly, the agreement gave investors and international institutions the confidence to continue to lend and invest in Mexico. The debt reduction agreement was negotiated with the help of the International Monetary Fund. From the debt crisis of 1982 through the development of the Mexican Reform Program to the debt reduction agreement of 1990, the IMF has worked to support Mexico's efforts. The IMF provided financial assistance, with loans totaling over $6 billion between 1982 and 1990. Those IMF funds included special loans to Mexico to be used to further reduce its debt. The IMF helped generate additional financing from other donors and gave economic advice and expertise to the Mexican government.
They've always been there, acting both as an orchestrator of external sources of support and also as de facto an advisor to the Mexican government. Sometimes the negotiations with the IMF get tough. We sometimes don't see things in the same light. But I would say that what the IMF is supporting is our program. They didn't come and tell us what our program should be. We had a good program. They supported the Mexican program. And it's worked out very well to the advantage of both the international financial system and Mexico.
We have a new economy, lots more modern, more competitive, more aggressive, entering markets which were unthinkable 5 years ago. So we still have a long road ahead. We'll have to work, to persevere. We have still many problems. Oh, but let me tell you, we are working now in the right direction.
The recent shift to democracy in Eastern Europe has been one of the most dramatic events of the 20th century. Now this political revolution is ushering in momentous economic changes as these countries attempt to move from central planning toward market economies. It's a transition that poses tremendous challenges and tremendous opportunities.
You have there history moving. What was just a dream 1 or 2 years ago is now news every day. So what IMF has to do there is to help this transition, to make sure that history moves for the best. And we are deeply involved in this process.
With 38 million people, Poland is the largest of the Eastern European countries. By the end of 1989, the country was deep in an economic crisis. Inflation was running at over 600%, the foreign debt had reached almost $40 billion, productivity was declining, and there were long lines for food and gasoline, with shortages of many essential goods. The new Solidarity-led government faced an enormous challenge: how to move from central planning to a market economy, an unprecedented change, while at the same time stopping inflation. Poland's leaders chose a radical program of reform, a shock treatment for the economy. It was a plan that would cause short-term hardships in the hope of long-term growth and prosperity.
I think it is a necessary shock treatment because of the situation which inherited the situation of hyperinflation. And our view was that there is no other way out of this situation than shock treatment.
The International Monetary Fund provided financial assistance and economic advice to support the Polish reform plan. Here is what some of those reforms looked like. Prices in Poland used to be determined by the state. That gave producers little incentive to produce more.
We got very low prices for the products. People were very unhappy because of that. And with the lack of machinery, it wasn't profitable for a farmer to produce more.
Fixed prices for farmers and other producers meant shortages for Polish families.
To dużym problemem, chyba najważniejszym problemem.
It was a problem for us because there was no food, and we were lining up sometimes for 2 hours, sometimes during the night, and we were lucky if we could find a kilogram of sausage. But it happened many times that the last 2 kilograms of sausage were bought by the person in front of us.
So the first step in the reform plan was freeing prices from state control, letting them be determined by supply and demand. The plan was put into effect on January 1st, 1990. Some of the changes were immediate and dramatic. Before, butcher shop shelves were empty. Now, meat overflows the counters in open-air markets. Items that were formerly in short supply, from meat to toilet paper to oranges and bananas, are now readily available. Of course, with prices free to rise, consumers now have to pay more than they did when prices were fixed. That's been difficult because wage increases are still being held in check to fight inflation. But once productivity improves, wages will be allowed to rise. And significantly, prices edge back down a bit after their initial jump in January, a tangible sign that the fight against inflation was beginning to work.
Ale jednak widzimy, że to jakoś w jakiś sposób się normuje.
I think it's getting pretty normal. More and more, it's better. And it's according to what Balcerowicz said. According to plan, we've noticed this decrease in prices.
Under the old system, state-run enterprises like this tractor factory produced what the government told them to, not what the market demanded. They could operate at a loss because that loss would be covered by a subsidy, money from the state. To pay the subsidies, the government would just print more money. That was a major cause of inflation. It also led to bloated, inefficient industries. So a major step in the reform program was cutting these subsidies. Now, enterprises like Ursus Tractor have to operate at a profit. If they can't, they can lay off workers or even go bankrupt. Making this change is difficult, but it's the only way for Poland to create efficient, productive industries that can compete in world markets.
Now we have to think about costs of our production. We have to think of the cost of the spare parts, and we must think about our customers. So we have some troubles, but it is new market.
Before, everyone was guaranteed a job in Poland, whether it was necessary or not. It was a form of welfare, but it was highly unproductive. Now, markets will determine which jobs are needed, not the state. Since layoffs from money-losing enterprises were unavoidable, Poland needed to create a social safety net for this difficult transition. This is an unemployment office in Warsaw, and these people are registering for unemployment benefits, something previously unheard of in Poland. The government created unemployment insurance as a more targeted form of welfare than unnecessary jobs. In addition to benefits, the office provides job placement, retraining, and small loans to start new businesses. No one is happy about unemployment, but it is a necessary byproduct of separating work from welfare and making the economy more efficient.
I think being realistic, we cannot hope for having a market economy without some margin of unemployment.
Even many Poles who have lost their jobs seem to support the reforms and accept the hardship as the price of a better future.
I support them. I support them because it's the only way to, to be close to the world, I think. Otherwise, everything got bankrupt. The whole state, the whole country.
Another important step in the reform plan is to privatize many state businesses, to sell them to private investors. One of the first was OMIG, a maker of electronic components. Former manager Marek Ogrodzki is the new owner. As a private company, OMIG could operate more efficiently. Ogrodzki closed several unnecessary departments and laid off workers, from 1,000 down to 700. Yet the company is producing more now than it did before. As the company prospers, Ogrodzki plans to raise salaries, hire more workers, and expand production into new areas. And soon he expects to be able to offer shares in the company to workers and the public. Privatization will be an important way to encourage new investment in Polish industry.
I think that the only way for Poland is privatization.
This is a commercial bank in Warsaw. Before, there used to be only one bank in Poland, the government bank. It combined the functions of a central bank, such as the U.S. Federal Reserve, with those of a commercial bank. There was no competition. One state monopoly decided who got credit and at what interest rates. But in late 1987, Poland asked the International Monetary Fund for help in separating its bank into a true central bank and a commercial banking system. Technical advisors from the IMF helped draw up a plan for the new system. Although much work remains to be done, the foundation has been laid for a modern banking system in Poland. This is another new site in Poland, a foreign exchange bureau. Before, the Polish currency, the zloty, was not freely convertible into other currencies. But it will need to be if Poland is to fully benefit from world trade and attract foreign investment. Formerly, there was an official exchange rate, which was overvalued, and an unofficial rate. As part of the reform plan, the zloty was officially devalued to the more realistic rate. Now, the exchange rate more accurately reflects the currency's value in the global economy. And there is limited convertibility to other currencies. A $1 billion stabilization fund was set up, financed by foreign donors, to back the currency and support the new exchange rate.
We have abolished the regime of multiple exchange rates, and we have introduced a unified and stable exchange rate. And this exchange rate turned to be stable without the need for any intervention.
These were some of the main Polish reforms: freeing prices from state control, cutting subsidies, creating a social safety net, privatizing state enterprises, restructuring the banking system, and moving toward a convertible currency. In just the first few months, there were several important signs that the reform plan was working. The exchange rate was stable, shortages disappeared, and inflation dropped from over 50% a month to 4% a month. Much remains to be done. Poland will have to deal with its foreign debt, generate new investment, and find a way to reduce terrible pollution as it develops economically. Success will take concerted effort over several years. The International Monetary Fund has been helping Poland through this transition. The fund provided technical advice and expertise to the Polish team that devised the reform plan. Then, on the eve of its introduction, IMF Managing Director Michel Comdessus traveled to Poland to finalize a financial assistance package for Poland of over $700 million for 1990. The fund stands ready to provide additional financing for Poland's reforms and continuing technical support as well. The IMF only provides financing to countries that have agreed to take realistic steps to strengthen their economies. This means that IMF approval can be an important catalyst for additional financial assistance from other donors, whether governments or commercial lenders. The $1 billion stabilization fund for the Polish currency is a good example.
The agreement with the IMF was important because it opened the way towards the other assistance, because everybody waited for the approval of the IMF.
This is extraordinary history indeed, but for the IMF it's ordinary life. We are there to assist countries precisely in this transitional time, in this crisis time, in time full of dangers and opportunities. And what we do there, as we do in Africa, as we do in Latin America, as we do with all the countries of the membership, is first to assist them with our advice in order to help them to promote sound or better policies. We assist them with our financing, and then after having taken risks with them, we try to help them in catalyzing international support for their action. This is a time for transition, time indeed for difficulties, but I am absolutely sure that in particular with the extraordinary example of courage the people of Poland is demonstrating, with sound economic policies, this should turn to the best.
In the early 80s, the economic situation of Ghana was truly desperate. Inflation had reached over 120%. Exports had dropped by half. Store shelves were empty, and there were long lines for scarce supplies of food and gasoline. Roads and other infrastructure were in disrepair, and there were hardly any cars, trucks, or buses on those roads, since more than 2/3 of the vehicles in Ghana were idled for lack of spare parts like batteries and tires. Ghana's economy had come to a standstill. Today, though, the same streets that once were empty are filled with traffic, and things are looking brighter in Ghana. The markets are full of shoppers because the stores are full of goods. Inflation is down and exports are up. Ghana still has a long way to go, but it is headed in the right direction. This remarkable turnaround was no accident. It was the result of an economic recovery plan instituted by the Ghanaian government. The plan was supported with economic advice and financial assistance from the International Monetary Fund.
The fund initially responded by providing assistance in designing a program to try to stabilize the economy and to try to address some of the structural problems which the economy was facing. In addition, the fund provided resources to assist Ghana to meet its balance of payments need.
Although each country's situation is unique, Ghana's experience shows that good economic policies can improve even the bleakest crisis.
Things are very, very critical, and all this because of a combination of things, some external, but others internal, just wrong policies, including wrong exchange rate policies that did not provide any incentives whatsoever for real productive activity.
Cocoa is Ghana's leading export. Ghana was once the world's leading producer of cocoa, but by 1983, the country was producing less than half as much cocoa as earlier. That's because farmers like Kofi Fofi didn't have much incentive to grow cocoa in those days.
Cocoa farming wasn't attractive. It was very discouraging because the producer prices were so low. And I even decided to cut the cocoa away and plant some other crop.
The problem was the exchange rate of the Ghanaian currency, the cedi. In the early 80s, the cedi was extremely overvalued. 2.75 cedis equaled $1 US. So cocoa producers like Kofi Fofi got very few cedis for each dollar of cocoa that they sold on world markets. They couldn't cover their costs and either cut back on production or in some cases smuggle their cocoa across the border to the Ivory Coast, where they could get a better rate of exchange. Either way, Ghana was losing its main source of foreign exchange.
And therefore, among other things, we adjusted the exchange rate so as to provide adequate incentives for those producing for export.
Whereas in 1983, the cedi had been valued at 2.75 cedis to the dollar, by 1990, the rate had fallen to 350 cedis to the dollar. Even when adjusted for inflation, it's made a big difference to cocoa farmers and other exporters.
About 10 years back, we were receiving about 750 cedis per bag. But now, we're receiving 10,900 cedis per bag. Now, I'm able to expand my farm and plant new crops.
Ghana is still dependent on world prices for its cocoa, but the more realistic exchange rate has helped boost production, and exports in general have doubled since 1983. This is another result of the new exchange rate policy in Ghana, a foreign exchange bureau. Before, the overvalued currency inspired black market transactions that gave more cedis per dollar than the official rate. Now the cedi has a realistic value, determined by supply and demand. Foreign exchange bureaus have been set up, and most of the black marketeers have gone out of business. Ghanaians working abroad are willing to send their earnings home, knowing they'll get a fair rate of exchange. And importers and exporters have an easy way of buying and selling foreign currencies. Sam Ledance opened the first foreign exchange bureau, or Forex, in Ghana.
Everybody likes to buy from the Forex bureau instead of going to the black market. So you see a lot of people coming, especially the traders, the exporters, and the importers. They all need it. They all buy from us.
Some of those traders can be found here in the market area of Accra. The streets and the shops are full of goods. It's a different scene than the early 80s, when Ghana saw shortages of almost everything.
The product wasn't on the shelf like this one. The store wasn't full like this because there were no goods in the system.
Goods weren't in the shops because then we were not allowed to import anything into the country.
In the early 80s, Ghana required importers to obtain import licenses. There were quota restrictions on some kinds of goods, and some imports were banned entirely. The result was empty shelves in the shops and a lack of needed spare parts for transportation and industry. So the government loosened the controls on imports, abolishing the licensing system and removing many restrictions. Now, all kinds of imports can be found in any shop in the market.
Yeah, business is good now for me. because anything I want to buy now, I can get it.
Today, there are any number of stores selling auto supplies, their shelves full of the spare parts that were so desperately needed in the early 80s.
And now it's far, far better, far better. See, so you can get anything at all you want, you see, provided you have the money anyway.
A freer import policy helps consumers. It's also critical for Ghanaian industries that need raw materials and spare parts for their plant and equipment. The Ghana Pioneer Aluminum Factory makes pots and pans for the domestic market and for export. The aluminum is produced here in Ghana, but the spare parts for the machinery come from abroad. And the company had to cancel several models because it didn't produce some of the fittings for the pots, such as spouts and handles. These had to be imported, and the old import licensing system was a problem.
At first, you have to apply for it. You have to go to the bureaucratic procedure, and then maybe they will tell you your application is rejected and so on and so forth. It's really important because, one, you are ready to put the goods on the market, but to get the inputs, the procedure is too cumbersome.
But now, Ghana Pioneer will be able to import whatever it needs to expand production.
If you have the money, you can bring in whatever you want without any constraint or problems.
These people are the vanguard of another economic reform in Ghana. They're tax collectors, and they're going door to door to encourage shopkeepers to pay their taxes.
We are from the Internal Revenue Service. Yeah, and we have come to look at your tax payments.
Increasing tax revenues was a top priority for Ghana. In the past, when the government was short of money, it had always printed more of it, leading to inflation of over 120% by 1983. So boosting revenues was a key step in the fight against inflation. Previously, tax rates were high and revenues were low. Now, rates have been lowered to encourage compliance.
Okay, please, do you have any employees here?
People are able to pay their tax on daily, weekly and monthly schedules to reduce the burden. And an education campaign has helped people understand what they're getting for their taxes.
Today there's awareness to the taxpayer why he should pay tax and for what the tax is being used for.
Collection efforts have been stepped up dramatically. In addition to the teams visiting the shops, trade groups collect taxes from their members. This group of traders is getting advice and answers to its questions about how to follow the tax collection procedures. And special tax police are empowered to stop taxis and other commercial vehicles to make sure they've paid their tax.
Our tax collection effort has been very successful. I mean, we've more or less more than doubled tax collection in almost every single area, every single tax item in our books.
The increased tax revenue has helped fight inflation. It's also meant more money for essential government services.
Collecting more money enabled us also to spend more, especially on social programs, education, health, roads, which had been run down for over a decade.
One of those programs is PAMSCAD, the program of actions to mitigate the social costs of adjustment. PAMSCAD helped Joyce Dunwell Iku set up this small clothing business in her home. Formerly, she was a government clerk. In order to reduce excess staff and contain government expenditures, Ghana has been trimming the government payroll and encouraging civil servants to find other jobs in the private sector.
They want the people working with the government to set up their own industry and things. So that is why I came out to set up my industry.
Joyce was trained in how to run a small business and received a small loan from PAMSCAD to purchase new sewing machines. Now she has 3 full-time employees and 6 apprentices and hopes to expand in the future.
Because we've had these machines, the number of people here can increase and our jobs to go up.
I believe there have been enormous changes. Ghana is a very good example of a country and the IMF working together.
Between 1983 and 1990, Ghana's economic situation improved greatly. As a result of the recovery program, goods were available to consumers. The streets were repaired and full of vehicles. Exports more than doubled, and inflation dropped from over 120% to around 30%. Ghana's recovery program was developed with the help of the International Monetary Fund.
Well, essentially what the fund tries to accomplish is, one, to help a country design better policies which will help it to stabilize its own economy.
In addition, the IMF provided financial assistance to Ghana at a time when commercial banks and individual governments were unwilling to lend.
When we started the program in 1983, we desperately needed additional resources because otherwise we were going to levy even greater hardship on our people. We were going to make all these changes, mind-boggling changes in prices, including the price of foreign exchange, without the benefit of additional resources that would enable us to bring in the raw material and bring the spare parts and let people see some improvement. So that balance of payment support initially was very, very critical.
The IMF's support of the reform program was also critical in unlocking financial assistance from other sources, such as governments and international agencies like the World Bank. Today, Ghana still faces tremendous problems. Poverty remains widespread. World cocoa prices have plummeted, hurting Ghana's export earnings. The recovery effort will need to continue for many years. But the outlook today is much brighter than in 1983.
I do believe that we can look at the future with some optimism, even in the face of the difficulties that are evident already.
Today's world is becoming more and more interdependent. Economic events that happen in one corner of the globe can have a significant impact on countries continents away. In a sense, the world economy is like a vast machine with interconnecting parts, and all these parts have to work smoothly together for the machine to function properly. But that doesn't just happen automatically. The world economic machine needs to be closely monitored in order to work well. It's a job that can't be done by any one country. It requires an impartial international organization whose membership comprises most of the nations of the world. That organization is the International Monetary Fund.
It's now universally admitted that our world is a small village. It is interdependent, and our institution has as a key task to make this interdependence to turn into an effective solidarity.
The International Monetary Fund is one of the world's most important financial institutions. But even on the street outside the IMF's Washington headquarters, many people don't know what the IMF is or does.
IMF? No.
International Monetary Fund.
Do you know what it is or what it does?
No. Not really sure.
The IMF? I don't know. Sorry.
So what exactly does the IMF do? Basically, it helps nations cooperate economically and promotes an orderly system of currency exchange rates and world trade. In everything it does, the IMF promotes sound economic policies so that all nations will grow and prosper together. Policies supported by the IMF have made a difference in countries throughout the world. These policies help a Ghanaian exporter get a decent price for his product, help Mexican manufacturers get the parts and raw materials they need from abroad, and help Polish consumers make the transition from central planning to a market economy, just to name a few examples. In general, the IMF supports policies of free and open trade, realistic exchange rates, and growth without inflation, with the goal of greater world prosperity. The IMF tries to ensure that policies followed by one country won't have a negative impact on others. Why is that so important? Well, the world economic machine functions beautifully when all its parts are coordinated and working together. But what happens when one part stops working properly? Not only does that country have problems, but it can cause problems for the others that interact with it. Each is dependent on the others in order to work smoothly, and if one gets too far out of line, it can damage the entire system. Here's a typical example. Leaders in several industrial nations have been grappling with the problem of budget deficits. These countries need to borrow to finance those deficits, and all that demand for funds pushes interest rates higher. So budget deficits mean higher costs for businesses and higher mortgage payments for homeowners in industrial nations. But that's also a problem for developing countries. Many of these countries have large foreign debts, and those higher interest rates in industrial nations mean higher debt payments for them. And that means less money for development, for schools and roads and electric projects. But it works both ways. What happens in developing countries can have an impact on industrial nations too. Take the debt crisis. This public works project in Mexico would have been a rare sight in the early 1980s. Because at the height of the debt crisis, developing countries couldn't afford many construction projects. That was hard for them. It was also hard for the companies that manufactured the earth movers for these projects. They and other industrial country exporters saw their market shrink, thanks to the debt crisis in developing countries.
Take the Mexican case. During these years where we were not able to find a solution for the debt problem, we decreased our imports from the U.S. by 40%. That's a specific example where, some U.S. Jobs were lost.
A country's interest rates and debt, exchange rates and trade policy, all affect and are affected by the economic policies in other countries. So there needs to be a forum where countries can consult with one another about economic policy decisions. That forum is the International Monetary Fund. Back in the Great Depression of the early 1930s, world trade was suffering. So many countries tried to boost their exports by artificially lowering the value of their currencies. That made their products cheaper to foreign buyers and undercut the competition. At the same time, they kept out imports. It was called beggar thy neighbor. But it only inspired other countries to do the same thing in return, making beggars of everybody. World trade fell further, and the Great Depression only got worse. Throughout the 30s and 40s, nations struggled to find a permanent solution that would prevent this happening again. Finally, in 1944 at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in the United States, their negotiations resulted in the formation of the International Monetary Fund and its sister organization, the World Bank. The IMF began with 39 member nations. They agreed to a system of stable exchange rates for converting one currency into another, and an end to the practices that led to the competitive devaluations of the 1930s.
The fund was established by people who remembered the Depression, and they remembered how trade wars, they remembered how currency conflicts made the world economic depression even worse than it otherwise would have been.
What I think is absolutely clear is that you cannot leave the world monetary system to run itself. We've got considerable experience from earlier times that that is a recipe for disaster and impoverishment. And indeed, that today prosperity is interdependent and that one country's prosperity depends upon the prosperity of all the others as well. No country, no economy is an island. prosperity of all the others as well. No country, no economy is an island.
Today, the International Monetary Fund provides a permanent framework for over 150 member nations to cooperate on economic policy. Each country is represented on the fund's board of governors, usually by its finance minister or central banker. They meet at the fund's annual and interim meetings, which take place twice a year. But most of the IMF's discussions take place here, at the meetings of the fund's executive board. 22 executive directors representing the entire membership meet at least 3 times a week to carry out the policies set by the member governments.
By joining efforts and joining knowledge and wisdom, we in the fund could coordinate our policies among ourselves, advise each other, and that is most effective way to gain stability and non-inflationary growth of members.
The executive board is chaired by the fund's managing director, who also heads the fund staff of 2,000. Unlike the executive directors who represent specific countries, the staff is responsible to the membership as a whole. In order to make policy decisions, the members of the fund need to know what the economic reality is. So the heart of the IMF's work is a regular consultation between the fund and each member country.
Review a bit the situation and how we should proceed in the days to come.
This is a group of IMF staff members in Washington preparing to leave on a consultation mission to a member country, Mexico. They're discussing economic trends and deciding which indicators will be particularly important. The following week, they arrive in Mexico City and begin reviewing economic data provided by the government. They'll want to see how the economy is performing, what areas have improved, and where potential trouble may lie. The mission consults with the country's financial leadership to get the critical input of the government's policymakers. Then, back in Washington, the team's report is presented to the membership through the executive board. Members discuss each country's policies, often critically, and make suggestions for how the country can improve its economic performance. While the fund cannot force its members to do anything, the suggestions of the board are taken seriously by members.
The peer pressure that one government puts on another, one finance minister puts on another finance minister, or one central banker on another central banker, is at the heart of how the fund as an institution can influence the behavior of governments.
It's seeing the greater good, the good of the whole system in this. If you've got bad policies, then sooner or later, everybody will suffer, including yourself. And therefore, I think it is what we would have called in an earlier day enlightened self-interest.
Consultations are carried out with each member once a year, from the smallest developing country to the largest industrial nation. Discussions take place even more frequently with the leading industrial nations because of their impact on the world economy.
How would you evaluate the inflation prospect?
Well, we're obviously following it very closely.
Those countries have such an important role in the world economy through their trade, through their investment, that it is absolutely essential that to the extent possible, their policies are harmonized and work together.
For the same reason, staff members at the IMF rely on these industrial nation consultations to prepare a biannual report called the World Economic Outlook. The report helps member countries coordinate their own policies with anticipated trends in the world economy.
What the report does, it highlights the interdependencies in the world economy. When one major country undertakes a specific policy measure, it impacts on the rest of the world. And obviously, therefore, the policy formation in this major country and in the rest of the world will need to take into account these effects.
The World Economic Outlook, the consultation process, and the meetings of the Executive Board and Board of Governors all help promote sound economic policies. But sometimes a country follows unsound policies, or it may suffer from external events such as depressed prices for its exports. That can result in a balance of payments problem, a shortage of foreign currency to buy goods from abroad. So another important function of the IMF is to help these countries with financial assistance. In August of 1982, Mexico had trouble paying the interest on its national debt. In effect, the country was at the brink of bankruptcy. That crisis was solved with financial assistance from the International Monetary Fund and the help of the United States. But Mexico was not alone. In the early 80s, developing countries around the world were hard-pressed to pay their debts. In 1983 and 84 alone, the IMF loaned $22 billion to member countries.
I think the countries of Latin America and Eastern Europe at that time would have drifted into major defaults, major, even worse cutbacks in trade. There might have been a breakdown of the international financial system at that time if the fund had not acted.
Countries with balance of payments problems turn to the IMF because it's the world's lender of last resort, a financial safety net. Members of the IMF share financial resources for the common good, just as they do policy advice and information.
It is an international credit union of the member countries who pool their resources, much like the members of a credit union do, to help each other out in times of difficulty.
Most of the fund's money comes from members' contributions in the form of quotas. Each country's quota is based on its importance in the world economy. Wealthier countries pledge more and poorer countries less. The quota also determines a country's voting power at the fund. The larger a country's contribution, the more votes it has. In 1990, the membership decided to increase their quotas to a total of about $180 billion. This pool of members' contributions circulates to be used by members who need it, then paid back in and used again. Each member can borrow more than it puts in amounts related to its quota. Any member wishing to borrow from the fund must adjust its economic policies in a way that will help solve its balance of payments problem. This combination of financial assistance and economic reform is also critical to resolving debt problems.
The most crucial function of the fund today is its traditional role, namely to make sure that when a country is confronted with a time of crisis, with difficulties, if these countries accept to address the problem and to take the measures it has to take, then the international financing will be provided to this country. International financing, international support, and of course all appropriate advice to make its policy as accurate as possible.
In response to its financial crisis of 1982, Mexico embarked on a sweeping program of economic reforms, supported by financial assistance and advice from the International Monetary Fund. One of those reforms was import liberalization, opening the trade system to the outside world. This is the Multi-Panel Company in Monterrey, a division of Grupo IMSA. It manufactures building panels and doors for the domestic market and for export. A few years back, the company didn't make this particular door. That's because the steel for the doors comes from Great Britain, and the panels are stamped in the United States. Under the old system of Mexican protectionism, it was too difficult and expensive to bring these imports into the country. But now the government has reduced import restrictions and cut tariffs dramatically.
Some years ago, most of the goods that Mexico needed to import required, first of all, an import license, which was kind of troublesome to get. Now, most of the goods that Mexico needs to be imported do not require an import license. Second, most of the goods had very high tariffs. Now, because of Mexico's openness to the international markets, the import duties have been lowered very much. So many of the imported goods are competitive with Mexican-made goods.
As a result, Multipanel has a new product. Volume has increased, new workers have been hired, and the company is exporting and earning foreign currency for Mexico. Ghana also had a hard time in the early 80s, but a continuing program of economic reforms supported by the IMF has helped Ghana overcome many of its problems. This is the ScanStyle furniture factory in Mim, Ghana. Today, ScanStyle is Ghana's leading furniture exporter, but things weren't always so bright. In the early 80s, ScanStyle and other Ghanaian exporters suffered because the Ghanaian currency, the cedi, was greatly overvalued, at only 2.75 cedis to the dollar.
Well, back in those days, it was suicide to export, because if you exported and earning such a low return of 2.75 cedis to the dollar, there isn't any way that you could have managed to cover your cost or been competitive abroad.
Then the Ghanaian government instituted a crucial economic reform. It lowered the value of the currency to a more realistic rate. That meant that exporters like Paul Pepera would get more cedis for each dollar they earned, making it profitable to export.
In 1983, the price of this dining chair was $21. And when we exported this dining chair, $21, we were getting a return of 60 cedis for this chair. This same chair, even if you take the same price of $21, now when we're exporting this chair, we're earning 6,500 cedis for our $21. So I think you can see the dramatic increase in our earnings, even if you take inflation into account.
Poland is another country that has embarked on a program of economic reforms with the support of the International Monetary Fund. In 1989, Poland faced a tremendous challenge: how to move from central planning to a market economy. One goal was to end the chronic shortages that had plagued Poland for years. Part of the problem was that prices were set by the state, not by markets. That gave producers, whether farmers or factories, little incentive to produce more of what consumers wanted. So on January 1st, 1990, the Polish government instituted a key reform. It freed prices from state control, allowing them to be determined by the market. The change brought almost instant results. Where before butcher shop shelves were empty, now meat overflows the counters in open-air markets. Items that were formerly in short supply, from meat to toilet paper to oranges and bananas, are now readily available. This change is now spreading to other sectors of the Polish economy as well.
I expect that the shortages which were very widespread under the previous economic system would disappear, and this is very important for the economic efficiency.
In supporting economic reforms around the world, the IMF serves as a lender of last resort to countries with balance of payments problems.
That balance of payment support initially was very, very critical. What I know is that in 1983, no bank was going to lend us money. Not that we could afford commercial bank money anyway.
But more importantly, financial assistance from the IMF can mobilize even greater resources from governments and banks. That's because donors see IMF-supported programs as a sign that countries are moving their economies in the right direction.
The agreement with the IMF was important because it opened the way towards the other assistance, because everybody waited for the approval of the IMF.
It means really the backing of the world, the international financial community, of our program. That's the catalytic effect where the IMF has a very constructive role.
And the IMF plays a vital role in providing advice and expertise to countries as they develop their economic reform programs.
They've always been there, acting both as an orchestrator of external sources of support and also as de facto an advisor to the Mexican government.
In addition to sharing views on policy and financial resources, members of the IMF share their collective expertise. Whether it's improving tax collection in Ghana, or advising on exchange rate policy in Mexico, or restructuring the banking system in Poland, the IMF provides technical assistance to members requesting it. It's a way of helping countries to strengthen their financial institutions.
By improving institutions, we ensure that economic adjustment programs continue and maintain their effects well beyond the expiration of the program.
Another important form of technical assistance is the IMF Institute. In classrooms at the IMF's Washington headquarters, government officials from all over the world come to gain specialized knowledge in economics and finance.
I take the responsibility of compiling government finance statistics back in my country. But that job was not something I learned formally. It was on the job. So by coming here, I know I'll be able to get a theoretical background as well as the practical knowledge. And that would deepen my understanding of the work that I will do when I go back to my country.
Many developing countries are still struggling with the debt burdens of the 70s and early 80s. But recently, there's been new hope. In March of 1990, an historic agreement was signed in Mexico City. Mexico and its commercial bank creditors agreed to reduce the amount of Mexican debt outstanding, saving Mexico almost $2 billion per year. The International Monetary Fund advised Mexico in developing the agreement. Mexico was also the first to use a new form of financial assistance from the IMF, in which funds are specifically earmarked for reducing a country's debt.
We are trying also to help them to reduce the heavy stock of the old debt to be able to devote more resources to the preparation of their future.
The world's poorest countries, most of them in sub-Saharan Africa, have posed a special challenge. Financial assistance from the IMF was always meant to be used for short-term balance of payments problems. But by the end of the 1980s, it had become apparent that many of these poorest countries were unable to adjust their economies quickly enough for this assistance to make a real difference.
We found that there is no quick fix with the African countries, and their problems are deep-rooted. And to deal with this problem, you have to have more time than usually is necessary.
Now the IMF is able to help these poorest nations with a special type of loan that can be paid back over 10 years at just 0.5% interest.
We believe these kind of resources are more designed to address the problems of these countries.
In 1989, the nations of Eastern Europe experienced momentous political change. Now these countries are attempting unprecedented economic change as well, moving from central planning to market economies. They will need all the expertise, experience, and financial assistance that the world financial community can muster if they are to succeed.
After the war, there was the Marshall Plan, which provided resources to the countries that were rebuilding Europe. And now there is no Marshall Plan, and there is no country prepared to do so. The fund can work as a catalyst in all this, in providing the resources to these countries.
A particular challenge will be to help these countries deal with devastating pollution and environmental damage at the same time as they develop economically.
There are trade-offs between growth and the environment in certain cases. And what we are trying to do now is to identify policy instruments with which this trade-off can be reduced. For example, introduction of pollution taxes, subsidies or incentives for energy conservation.
As an impartial organization joining together over 150 nations, the IMF is uniquely suited to address the challenges of the 1990s.
Problems like the oil crisis in the 1970s, or the debt crisis in 1982, or the transformations that are taking place in Eastern Europe today are problems that cannot be solved by one country. It takes more countries. They have to sit down. They have to decide how to work together.
There is a silent revolution. I mean by that the fact that in all countries in the world, almost in all of them, governments now recognize that there are good policies, policies which work, and bad policies. And they recognize that what the IMF does is precisely to help them to promote these good policies.
The International Monetary Fund is a cooperative organization where members pool their resources for their mutual benefit, resources of policy advice, expertise, and financial assistance. As the world grows ever more interdependent, the IMF's role as mediator of the world financial system will become even more important. By helping members to follow sound policies, the IMF is working to foster greater economic growth and prosperity for the entire world community.